This seat is for my real daughter. You don't belong here." My husband said it so calmly at the Christmas table that for a second, I thought I had misheard him. Like maybe the clinking of glasses or the hum of holiday music had twisted his words into something crueler than he intended. But no one laughed. No one corrected him. And when I looked around that long oak table I had polished myself just hours before, I saw it clearly in their faces, the quiet agreement, the acceptance, the subtle shift that said I was no longer part of what I had spent years building, and I felt something inside me go very still, not shattered, not loud. Just still, like the moment right before snow begins to fall. I set my fork down gently beside my plate, the one I had chosen from our best china set, the one I used every Christmas because I believed traditions meant something, because I believed family meant something, and I smiled, the kind of small, polite smile you give strangers when you don't want to cause a scene. Then I stood up, smoothing the front of my navy sweater as if I were just adjusting myself, as if I hadn't just been told I didn't belong at my own table, and I stepped aside, letting his daughter, Emily, slide into the seat I had been sitting in, the seat at the head of the table, the one I had always taken because I was the one who planned everything, organized everything, paid for everything, and no one stopped her, not even my son Daniel, who sat 2 chairs down pretending to be very interested in his glass of wine. The room filled back up with noise almost instantly. Laughter rising again, forks clinking, someone turning up the volume on the Christmas playlist, and just like that, I disappeared from the center of it all, like I had never been there to begin with. I picked up my plate and moved to the far end of the table, a smaller chair near the corner, one that didn't even have a name card, because apparently there hadn't been one made for me this year. Something I only noticed now as I set my plate down and sat, quietly, folding my hands in my lap for a moment before reaching for my fork again. Because habits are hard to break, especially the ones that teach you to keep the peace no matter what it costs you. The tree in the living room sparkled through the doorway, lights reflecting off ornaments I had collected over decades, each one carrying a memory I used to think we all shared, the handmade ones from Daniel's childhood, the glass ones Robert and I had bought during our first Christmas together, the little wooden angel my late mother had given me, all of it still there, still glowing, as if nothing had changed. And yet everything had. I watched Emily lean toward Robert, her voice soft but confident, her hand resting on his arm in that familiar way that always seemed to draw his full attention. And he smiled at her, a proud, warm smile I hadn't seen directed at me in a long time. And I realized then that this moment, this small, quiet humiliation, hadn't come out of nowhere. It had been building, layer by layer, decision by decision, silence by silence, and I had been too busy holding everything together to notice that I was slowly being moved out of the picture. 2 days earlier, I had been standing in the hallway outside Robert's study, holding a stack of receipts and a list of last-minute groceries, debating whether we needed one more bottle of wine, when I heard my name, not spoken with affection, not even with irritation, but with calculation, like a problem to be solved. And I stopped, not because I meant to listen, but because something in the tone made me pause, and through the slightly open door, I heard Emily say, "It's easier than you think, Dad. Once she signs, everything transfers clean. The house, the accounts, all of it." And Robert responded in that same calm voice he had used at the dinner table, "She trusts me. She won't question it." And I remember standing there, my hand tightening around the papers until the edges dug into my skin, my heart beating not faster, but heavier, like it was sinking instead of racing, because in that moment, something shifted, not in them, but in me, and I understood, with a clarity I hadn't allowed myself before, that I wasn't just being overlooked, I was being repositioned, quietly, strategically, and the life I thought I was sharing was already being rewritten without me. I didn't confront them, I didn't push open the door or demand answers, because for the first time in a very long time, I realized that reacting in the moment would only give them what they expected, and I was done being predictable. Instead, I walked back to the kitchen, set the receipts down, and finished preparing dinner plans as if nothing had happened, my movement steady, my mind already moving ahead of them, already considering what I needed to do, who I needed to call, what documents I needed to find, because if they thought I was just a name on a piece of paper, something easy to erase, they had misunderstood me entirely. And now, sitting at the edge of that Christmas table, listening to their laughter rise and fall like I wasn't part of it. I realized something else, something even quieter, even more certain. They believed they had already taken my place. They believed this moment proved it. But what they didn't know, what none of them knew as they passed dishes around and toasted to family, was that the story they were so comfortable settling into was already beginning to turn, and I had made sure of that long before I ever stood up from that chair. I did not cry that night, not when the dishes were cleared, not when the laughter slowly faded into smaller conversations, and not even when I stood alone in the kitchen rinsing plates I had spent all day preparing, because crying would have meant I was surprised, and the truth was, I was not surprised anymore. I was simply finished pretending that I had not seen what had been right in front of me for months. I dried each plate carefully, placing it back into the cabinet in the exact order I had arranged earlier that morning, because order had always been my way of keeping control, of making sense of things when people did not. And as I worked, I replayed the past 48 hours in my mind, not with panic, but with a kind of quiet precision, like someone reviewing a map before choosing a new direction. 2 mornings before Christmas, I had woken up earlier than usual, the house still wrapped in that soft gray light that comes just before sunrise, and I had gone downstairs to start the coffee, expecting the familiar comfort of routine, but instead I found Emily already in the kitchen, standing at the counter with her phone in one hand and my handwritten grocery list in the other, scanning it with a small, dismissive smile that she did not bother to hide when she realized I was watching. "Oh, good morning," she had said, her tone light, but edged with something sharper. "I was just looking at your list. I made a few changes. I hope that is okay." And she placed the paper back down as if it had never really been mine to begin with. As if the hours I had spent planning every detail were just a suggestion waiting to be improved. I nodded, because that had become my habit, to nod, to adjust, to allow small things to pass so that bigger things would not break. But something about the way she moved around my kitchen, opening cabinets without asking, shifting items on the counter, replacing ingredients with ones she preferred, made me feel like a guest in a place I had built with my own hands. Robert came in shortly after, his footsteps slow but steady, his attention going immediately to Emily, asking her about the changes she had made, complimenting her choices without even glancing at me. And I stood there holding 2 coffee mugs, realizing I had already become invisible in my own morning routine. Later that afternoon, Daniel had arrived, his coat still dusted with the light snow that had started falling outside, and he pulled me aside in the hallway, his voice low, his expression tight in a way I had not seen since he was a teenager, trying to tell me something he did not fully understand himself. "Mom," he said, "I do not like how things feel here. They have been talking about the house, about money." And I looked at him carefully, not because I doubted him, but because I needed to understand how much he knew, how much he had heard, and I placed a hand on his arm, steady, reassuring. "It is all right," I told him, even though I knew it was not. "Just enjoy Christmas." And he frowned, clearly unconvinced, but he nodded anyway, because that is what children do, even when they are grown. They trust the calm in their mother's voice more than the worry in their own mind. That evening, as the house filled with the scent of cinnamon and roasted turkey, I found myself moving through each room with a heightened awareness, noticing details I might have ignored before, the way Emily had rearranged the seating chart on the dining table, replacing the name cards I had written with her own, the way Robert had reviewed a stack of documents in his study with the door slightly ajar, his voice low but purposeful, and when I passed by, he quickly gathered the papers together, offering me a smile that felt practiced rather than genuine. "Just some paperwork," he said, "nothing you need to worry about." And I smiled back, because I had already learned that what people tell you not to worry about is often exactly what you should pay attention to. Later that night, when the house had quieted and the lights were dimmed, I returned to that hallway outside his study, not out of curiosity, but out of certainty. And that was when I heard it, the conversation that changed everything. Emily's voice steady and confident, explaining how simple it would be, how clean the transfer would look, how once I signed, there would be no complications, and Robert agreeing, not hesitantly, not reluctantly, but with the calm assurance of someone who believed the outcome was already decided. And I stood there listening, not as a victim, but as someone gathering information. each word settling into place like pieces of a puzzle I had been slowly assembling without realizing it. I did not interrupt them. I did not make a sound. I simply stepped back and returned to the bedroom, closing the door quietly behind me, and I sat on the edge of the bed for a long time, my hands folded in my lap, my mind moving through years of memories, choices, and decisions, tracing back to the moment I had agreed to marry Robert, to merge our lives, to share everything, believing that partnership meant trust, believing that love meant security, and I realized that while I had been building a life together, he had been building a plan of his own. The next morning, when he handed me the documents at the kitchen table, his expression warm, his tone casual. "Just a restructuring," he said. "It will make things easier for both of us." I took the papers, glanced over them briefly, and then looked up at him with the same calm smile I had worn so many times before. "Of course," I said, and I signed, my hand steady, my expression unchanged, because what he did not know, what Emily did not know, was that I had already made my own arrangements. I had already spoken to someone who understood exactly what needed to be done, and as I placed the pen back on the table, I realized something that filled me not with fear, but with clarity. They believed they were guiding the story. They believed they were moving me out of the way, but in reality, they had only shown me where I needed to stand, and now, sitting at the edge of that Christmas table, watching them celebrate what they thought was already theirs, I understood that the quietest moments are often the ones that change everything, and I had chosen mine carefully. The next morning felt quieter than it should have, as if the house itself had already decided to step back and watch what would happen next, and I moved through it slowly, deliberately, not out of hesitation, but because I understood now that every small action mattered, every glance, every word, every silence, and when I entered the kitchen, I found Robert already seated at the table with his coffee, the same documents from the day before resting neatly beside him as if they were just another part of our routine, as if nothing unusual had taken place. And he looked up at me with that familiar, easy smile, the one that used to reassure me, the one that used to mean we were on the same side. And for a moment, I almost admired how natural he made it all seem, how seamlessly he carried on as though trust had not been quietly dismantled piece by piece. "Did you sleep well?" he asked, his voice warm, steady, practiced, and I nodded as I poured myself a cup of coffee, the scent rising gently, grounding me in something real, something simple. "I did," I replied, and that was the truth, because once clarity arrives, sleep comes easier, not harder, and I had not spent the night worrying. I had spent it deciding. Emily joined us shortly after, her presence filling the room with a kind of confident energy that always seemed to shift the balance, and she greeted me politely, even pleasantly, as if the tension I had heard in her voice the night before had never existed, as if we were simply a family preparing for a holiday, and she began discussing plans for the day, final touches for dinner, small adjustments that she presented as helpful but executed as authority, and Robert listened to her with full attention, nodding, agreeing, reinforcing her role in a way that made it clear who he believed was leading this household now. And I stood there, holding my cup, observing them not as someone being pushed aside, but as someone seeing the full picture for the first time. After breakfast, I excused myself and stepped outside, the cold air sharp against my face, the sky pale and open, and I walked down the driveway slowly, not because I had nowhere to go, but because I knew exactly where I needed to be, and a short drive later, I found myself sitting across from a woman named Patricia Green, a lawyer I had been referred to years ago but had never needed until now, her office quiet, organized, the kind of place where things were handled carefully, deliberately, without unnecessary emotion, and I placed my folder on her desk, the documents Robert had given me, along with copies of everything I had quietly gathered over the past day, bank statements, property records, trust documents I had nearly forgotten existed but had taken the time to locate, and she reviewed them with a calm focus that immediately told me I had come to the right place. "You signed these?" she asked, glancing up briefly, and I nodded. "Yes, but I would like to understand exactly what they believe they were doing," and she allowed herself a small, knowing smile before returning her attention to the papers, and after several minutes, she leaned back slightly, folding her hands together. "What they believed," she said carefully, "is that they were simplifying control. What they did not realize is that your existing trust overrides almost everything in these documents. And I felt a quiet confirmation settle in. Not relief, not surprise, just confirmation that my instincts had been right, that the foundation I had built long before Robert ever entered my life had not disappeared simply because I had chosen to share parts of it. We spoke for nearly an hour, discussing options, timelines, protections, and I listened closely, asking questions not out of fear, but out of precision, because I was no longer reacting, I was preparing, and before I left, Patricia handed me a set of updated documents, clear, concise, and most importantly, protective. You do not need to confront them yet, she said. In fact, it may be better if you do not, and I nodded, because I had already come to that conclusion myself. Confrontation would only reveal what I knew, and right now, what mattered was what they did not know. When I returned home, the house was full again, the sounds of preparation, the movement of people, the illusion of togetherness, and I stepped back into it seamlessly, placing my coat away, picking up where I had left off, as if nothing had changed, as if I had not just ensured that everything they thought they were taking was already beyond their reach. And as the day moved forward, I noticed the details more clearly than ever, the way Emily directed small decisions, without asking, the way Robert deferred to her, the way Daniel watched quietly from the edges, his expression thoughtful, uncertain, as if he sensed something shifting but could not yet name it. By the time evening approached, and the final preparations for Christmas dinner were underway, the house looked exactly as it should have. Warm lights, carefully arranged decorations, the table set beautifully, every detail in place. And yet, beneath it all, there was a current running just below the surface, something unspoken, something waiting. And as I stood there, adjusting the last centerpiece, I realized that the moment at the table the night before had not been the beginning of anything. It had been the confirmation, the visible sign of something that had already been set in motion, and now, the next part would not belong to them. Because while they believed they were moving me out of the picture, I had already redrawn the entire frame, and this time, I would decide exactly how the story unfolded. That evening, as the last of the daylight faded and the soft glow of Christmas lights took over the house, I stood in the dining room alone for a moment, looking at the table I had set once again, each plate placed exactly where it belonged, each glass polished until it caught the light just right. And I ran my fingers lightly along the edge of the table, feeling the smooth wood beneath my hand, remembering the years it had taken to build a life that felt solid, dependable, something I believed could not be quietly taken from me without notice. And yet here I was, seeing clearly how easily that illusion had been maintained while everything underneath it shifted. I adjusted one of the name cards, one that Emily had rewritten in her own neat, confident handwriting, and I noticed again that there was still no place marked for me, not at the center, not even at the side, just a quiet absence where I used to be. And instead of correcting it, I let it remain exactly as it was, because sometimes the most important truths reveal themselves when you stop trying to fix what others have intentionally broken. Voices drifted in from the living room, laughter, conversation, the familiar rhythm of a family gathering that, on the surface, looked warm and complete, and I listened for a moment, before stepping away, carrying with me not sadness, but a growing sense of understanding, a clarity that made everything feel sharper, more defined. I moved into the kitchen, checking the oven, stirring the sauce, going through the motions I had repeated for decades, but this time I was not doing it to hold everything together. I was doing it because I chose to, because I knew exactly what I was preparing for, and that difference, though invisible to everyone else, changed everything for me. Emily entered a few minutes later, her heels clicking softly against the tile, her presence filling the room with that same controlled confidence she carried everywhere, and she leaned lightly against the counter, watching me with a small, polite smile that did not quite reach her eyes. "Everything looks beautiful," she said, her tone smooth, measured. "You always do such a wonderful job with these things," and I nodded, stirring the pot slowly. "Thank you," I replied, keeping my voice even. Because compliments that come without sincerity are not meant to be accepted. They are meant to soften the ground before something else is placed on top of them. She stepped closer, glancing around the kitchen as if evaluating it, as if already imagining it as something that belonged to her. And after a moment, she spoke again, more casually this time. Dad mentioned you signed the paperwork. That is really going to simplify things going forward. And I turned slightly to face her, meeting her gaze directly, not with confrontation, but with a calm steadiness that seemed to catch her off guard for just a second. Yes, I said. It will certainly clarify things. And she held my gaze a moment longer before nodding, satisfied, believing she understood exactly what I meant. And then she turned and left the room, her confidence intact, her assumption unchallenged. I watched her go, then returned my attention to the stove, letting the quiet settle around me again. And I thought about how easily people mistake silence for agreement, how quickly they fill in the gaps with their own expectations, and how powerful it can be to let them do exactly that. Dinner came together smoothly, as it always did, dishes arranged, food served, chairs filled, and once again, I took my place at the far end of the table, the unmarked seat, the one no one questioned, the one that allowed me to see everything without being directly seen. And from there, I observed the dynamics unfold with a clarity I had never had before. The way Robert deferred to Emily in small decisions, the way she spoke as if she were already in control, the way Daniel watched quietly, his eyes moving between all of us as if he were trying to understand something just beyond his reach. Conversation flowed easily, topics shifting from holiday plans to future ideas. And then, almost naturally, it turned toward the house, toward what should happen next. And Emily spoke first, her tone thoughtful but certain. It would make sense to keep everything streamlined, especially with the property. Keeping it within the family structure is important. And she glanced at Robert, who nodded in agreement, adding, "It is about making things easier for everyone in the long run." And I listened, my hands resting lightly in my lap, my expression calm, because this was the moment I had already heard before. The conversation they thought was new, but had actually been rehearsed in private, and now it was being presented openly, as if it were a logical, reasonable step. I let them continue, let the ideas unfold, let the assumptions build, and when there was a natural pause, I looked up, meeting Robert's eyes first, then Emily's, and I asked quietly, "And where do I fit into that structure?" The question hung in the air for a moment, not loud, not aggressive, just present. And for the first time that evening, there was a shift, a subtle hesitation, as if they had not fully prepared for that part of the conversation, and Emily smiled lightly, the kind of smile meant to reassure without actually answering. "Of course you are part of it, Margaret. This is all for the benefit of the family." And I nodded slowly, as if considering her words, as if accepting them at face value. And then I returned my attention to my plate, because sometimes the most effective response is not to challenge what is said, but to let it exist exactly as it is, incomplete, unsupported, waiting for what comes next. The rest of the dinner continued without interruption, the surface remaining smooth, the tension settling back beneath it where it could not be easily seen. And as the evening wound down and people began to move into the living room, carrying drinks and small plates, I remained seated for a moment longer, looking down the length of the table, at the empty spaces, the used dishes, the quiet evidence of what had just taken place, and I realized that everything I needed had already been revealed, not in what they said, but in what they assumed. And as I stood up and began to clear the table, my movement steady, unhurried, I knew that the next step would not require raising my voice or forcing a confrontation, because the groundwork had already been laid, and this time, I was not reacting to their decisions, I was preparing to redefine them entirely. After everyone drifted into the living room, carrying their laughter with them like nothing had shifted, I remained in the dining room a little longer, gathering plates one by one, stacking them carefully in my hands, the porcelain cool and familiar, and I moved slowly, not because I needed more time, but because I understood that this quiet space, this moment after the performance, was where the truth settled most clearly. The table looked different now, not because anything had changed physically, but because I could finally see it without the story I had been telling myself for years, the story that said I was still at the center of this family, that my place was secure, that the life I had built could not be quietly reassigned without my consent. And as I lifted the last plate, I noticed the faint indentation where my name card used to sit, a small, almost invisible mark that only I would recognize. and I ran my thumb over it briefly before turning toward the kitchen. The house was filled with soft music and distant conversation, the kind that floats easily when people feel comfortable, when they believe everything is going according to plan. And I could hear Emily's voice rising above the others, confident, animated, as she described ideas for the future, changes she envisioned, improvements she wanted to make, and I paused for just a second at the doorway, listening, not as someone excluded, but as someone gathering the final pieces of a picture that was already complete. "We could renovate the back wing," she was saying. "Open it up, make it more modern, more functional." And someone responded with interest, agreement, curiosity, and then she added, almost casually, "It will be easier once everything is officially transferred." It just makes sense. And there it was again, that quiet assumption, that steady belief that what they wanted was already inevitable, that the steps they had taken behind closed doors were enough to secure the outcome. And I stepped into the kitchen without making a sound, setting the plates down in the sink, turning on the water, letting the steady flow create a soft barrier between their world and mine. I washed each dish slowly, methodically, the warm water running over my hands, the rhythm of it grounding me. And I thought about how many times I had stood in this exact spot, cleaning up after gatherings, making sure everything was taken care of, believing that this was part of what it meant to belong, to contribute, to be valued. And now, standing here again, I realized that the value had never been in the work itself, but in who controlled the meaning of it. And for the first time, that control was shifting back to me. Daniel appeared in the doorway a few minutes later, leaning lightly against the frame, his expression thoughtful, uncertain, and he watched me for a moment before speaking. "Mom," he said quietly, "are you okay?" And I turned off the water, drying my hands with a towel, then looked at him, really looked at him, seeing the concern he was trying not to show too clearly, the questions he was not sure how to ask, and I offered him a small, steady smile. "I am more than okay," I said, and he frowned slightly, as if that answer did not match what he expected. It just did not feel right. "What he said earlier," he continued, his voice low. "You should not have been treated like that." And I nodded, acknowledging his words without feeding into the emotion behind them, because what I needed from him right now was not reaction, but awareness. I stepped closer, placing a hand lightly on his arm. "Sometimes people show you exactly who they are," I said, my voice calm, even. "And when they do, the most important thing is not how you feel in that moment, but what you choose to do next." He looked at me carefully, searching for something deeper in my words, and I could see that he sensed there was more I was not saying, but he did not push. And after a moment, he nodded slowly. "Okay," he said, though it sounded more like a promise to himself than an agreement with me. He returned to the living room, and I stayed where I was for a moment longer, listening to the soft hum of voices, the clink of glasses, the familiar sounds of a family that believed it was secure. And I realized that what made this moment different from all the others was not what they were doing, but what I was no longer willing to accept without question. Later that night, after the guests had left and the house had quieted once again, Robert found me in the living room, sitting in my usual chair, a blanket folded neatly over my lap, the lights from the tree casting a soft glow across the room, and he approached me with that same calm demeanor, as if the earlier moment at the table had already been forgotten. "You have been quiet tonight," he said, settling into the chair across from me, his tone gentle, almost concerned, and I looked at him for a moment before responding, studying his face, the lines I knew so well, the expressions I had trusted for years, and I realized that what I saw now was not unfamiliar. It was simply no longer filtered through the belief that it was always aligned with me. "I have been listening," I replied, my voice steady, and he nodded, as if that made sense to him, as if listening was all there was to it. And he leaned forward slightly, his hands resting together. "About the paperwork," he began, "I think this is going to be a good step for us. For the future, it simplifies things, makes everything more efficient." And I held his gaze, not interrupting, not challenging, just allowing him to say what he needed to say, because sometimes the most revealing thing a person can do is explain their reasoning without being asked to defend it. When he finished, I inclined my head slightly, as if considering his words, and then I said, "Clarity is always helpful." And he seemed satisfied with that, as if my agreement was complete. as if the conversation did not require anything more. And after a few more minutes of casual discussion, he stood and wished me good night, leaving the room with the same quiet confidence he had carried all evening. I remained where I was, the house now silent except for the soft hum of the heater and the faint ticking of the clock on the wall, and I looked at the tree, at the lights reflecting off the ornaments, each one holding a piece of a story I had believed in, and I realized that stories only hold power as long as you continue to tell them the same way. And tonight, without raising my voice, without creating a scene, I had already begun to change mine, not by reacting to what had been done, but by deciding what would happen next, and for the first time in a long time, I felt not displaced, not diminished, but quietly in control of something they had not even realized was still mine to shape. The house settled into a quiet stillness that night, the kind that comes after something important has already shifted but has not yet been acknowledged out loud, and I moved through it one last time before going upstairs, turning off lights, straightening small things that did not need straightening, more out of habit than necessity, because for years this had been my way of closing the day, making sure everything was in place, making sure nothing was left unfinished. And as I paused at the base of the staircase, I looked back toward the dining room, toward the table that had revealed more in one evening than I had allowed myself to see in months, and I realized that the routine I had followed so faithfully was no longer about maintaining a life together. It was about preparing to redefine it. The next morning came with a soft gray light filtering through the windows, the kind of quiet morning that usually feels peaceful, but now felt precise, deliberate, as if every moment was part of something larger. And I woke early, not because I could not sleep, but because I had already decided what needed to be done, and when I walked into the kitchen, the space felt different, not unfamiliar, but no longer assumed, as if I were seeing it not as something that belonged to everyone, but as something that had always, quietly, been mine to manage, mine to understand, mine to protect. I made coffee, the familiar sound grounding me. And as the machine hummed softly, I opened my folder at the kitchen table, reviewing the documents Patricia had given me the day before, each page clear, structured, leaving no room for misinterpretation, and I read them carefully, not because I did not understand them, but because I wanted to feel the certainty of them again, the quiet assurance that while others believed they were simplifying control, they had in fact overlooked the one structure that mattered most. Robert entered a few minutes later, his presence filling the room with the same calm confidence he had carried for days, and he greeted me with an easy familiarity, as if nothing had shifted, as if the previous night had been just another dinner, another conversation, another step forward in what he believed was a shared plan. "Good morning," he said, reaching for his coffee, and I looked up, offering the same steady response I had given him before, "Good morning." And there was something almost ironic in how normal it all felt on the surface, how easily two people could sit across from each other carrying entirely different understandings of the same reality. Emily joined us shortly after, her energy already directed, purposeful, and she moved through the kitchen with the same quiet authority she had been building over time, adjusting small things, making suggestions, speaking as though decisions had already been agreed upon, and Robert followed her lead without question, reinforcing the dynamic that had become so clear to me now, and I watched them both, not with resentment, not with anger, but with a clarity that allowed me to see each interaction for exactly what it was, not more, not less. After breakfast, I excused myself again, gathering my coat, my folder, and my keys, and when Robert asked where I was headed, I answered simply, "I have a few things to take care of," and he nodded, unconcerned, because in his mind, everything that mattered had already been handled, everything important had already been signed, and I stepped outside into the cold morning air, the sky brighter now, the world moving forward as it always does, regardless of what changes inside a home. I drove first to the bank, a place I had visited many times before, but never with this level of awareness, and as I sat across from the manager, explaining that I needed to review and adjust certain account structures, I spoke calmly, clearly, providing exactly what was needed without offering anything unnecessary, and she listened carefully, processing the information, confirming details, and as we worked through each account, each authorization, I felt a quiet sense of alignment, not because something new was being created, but because something that had always been in place was now being reinforced, clarified, secured in a way that could not be easily overlooked. From there, I went to a second appointment, another step, another layer, ensuring that every piece connected exactly as it should, and by the time I returned home, the day had moved forward, the house once again filled with the sounds of preparation, of planning, of a future they believed was already taking shape. I stepped inside, removing my coat, placing my folder in the same drawer I had always used, blending seamlessly back into the environment, and Emily greeted me with a brief smile. "We were just talking about next week," she said, her tone light. "There are a few things we will need to organize," and I nodded. "Of course," I replied, because at this point, allowing them to continue speaking freely was not only easy, it was useful, each assumption, each plan, each expectation revealing more about how they believed things would unfold. The afternoon passed in a quiet rhythm, small conversations, light planning, the appearance of cooperation maintained without effort, and as the sun began to lower, casting long shadows across the rooms, I found myself once again standing in the living room, looking at the space with a new perspective, not as something I was being moved out of, but as something I had never truly relinquished control over. And that realization settled in with a calm certainty, not dramatic, not overwhelming, just steady, like a decision that had already been made. That evening, as we sat together again, not for a formal dinner this time, but for something quieter, more casual, I listened as Robert and Emily discussed timelines, next steps, small details that they believed would soon become reality, and I noticed how confidently they spoke, how naturally they assumed that everything was aligned in their favor, and I allowed that confidence to remain untouched, because sometimes the most effective way to shift a situation is not to challenge it directly, but to let it reach its natural conclusion. And as I sat there, my hands resting lightly in my lap, my expression calm, I understood that they were not just revealing their plans, they were revealing their certainty, and certainty, when misplaced, has a way of unraveling quietly, completely, and when it does not require force. It simply requires the truth to stand where it has always been, waiting to be seen. By the third day after Christmas, the house no longer felt like a place where something was about to happen. It felt like a place where something had already been decided by everyone except the one person it actually belonged to. And I moved through it with a quiet awareness that made every detail sharper, every interaction clearer, as if the noise of assumption had finally faded enough for me to hear what was really being said beneath it. Emily had started leaving papers on the kitchen counter, not directly addressed to me, not explained, just placed there as if their presence alone would guide things forward, and I would glance at them as I passed, noting the headings, the outlines, the subtle language that framed everything as a natural transition, a logical next step, and I never touched them, never asked about them, because I understood that what they wanted was not just agreement. They wanted confirmation, and silence, when used correctly, can look exactly like that. Robert had become even more relaxed, his movements unhurried, his tone lighter, as though a burden had already been lifted from him, and I noticed how easily he spoke about the future now, how casually he referred to changes that had not actually taken place, and how he no longer hesitated when discussing plans with Emily, as if the structure of the household had already shifted in his mind, as if roles had already been reassigned without the need for acknowledgement. Daniel, on the other hand, watched everything more closely than before, his presence quieter but more intentional, and I could see that he was beginning to connect the moments, the conversations, the small inconsistencies that did not quite align, and one afternoon, as I was folding laundry in the den, he stepped in and closed the door behind him, his expression more direct this time, less uncertain. "Mom," he said, "something is not right. I can feel it." And I set the towel down in my hands, looking at him with the same calm I had carried through all of this, because his awareness mattered, but so did his timing, and I nodded slowly. "You are right," I said, not offering more, not explaining, just confirming what he already knew. And he waited, expecting something else, some detail, some clarification, but when I did not continue, he exhaled softly, running a hand through his hair. "Are you going to do something about it?" he asked, and I held his gaze for a moment before answering. "I already have. And that was enough to shift something in his expression, not confusion, not fear, but a cautious understanding that there was more beneath the surface than he could yet see. And he nodded, stepping back, trusting me in a way that felt both familiar and newly grounded. Later that evening, Emily approached me in the hallway, her steps measured, her expression composed, and she spoke with a tone that carried both politeness and intention. "I was thinking," she said, "it might be helpful if we all sit down tomorrow and go over everything together, just to make sure we are aligned." And I turned slightly toward her, meeting her eyes with the same steady calm I had maintained. "That sounds like a good idea," I replied, and she smiled, satisfied, believing that this meeting would simply formalize what she already assumed was in motion. And as she walked away, I understood that this was the moment they had been working toward, the moment where assumption would be presented as agreement, where expectation would be framed as reality. That night, I sat in the living room once again, the house quiet, the lights dim, and I reviewed the documents one more time, not because I doubted them, but because I respected what they represented, the structure I had built long before any of this began, the foundation that had remained intact even as others tried to reshape what they did not fully understand. And I thought about how easily people overlook what they do not see directly, how quickly they assume control when something appears accessible, and how rarely they consider that what is visible is not always what is decisive. The next morning arrived with a different kind of energy, a subtle anticipation that moved through the house, and when I entered the dining room, the table had been set again, not for a celebration this time, but for a discussion, papers arranged neatly, chairs positioned deliberately, and Emily was already there, reviewing her notes, her posture confident, her expression focused, while Robert stood nearby, his presence steady, supportive, and Daniel took a seat quietly, his attention moving between all of us. Waiting, I walked to the far end of the table, the same unmarked place I had taken before, and I sat down without comment, placing my hands lightly in front of me, my posture relaxed, my expression calm, and Emily began to speak, outlining their perspective, their plan, the reasons behind it. Each point presented clearly, logically, as if it were simply a matter of alignment rather than a question of ownership, and Robert added his voice at intervals, reinforcing her points, confirming their shared understanding, and I listened without interruption, allowing them to present everything fully, because clarity, when given space, often reveals more than argument ever could. When they finished, there was a brief pause, the kind that invites response, and I looked at the papers in front of them, then at each of them in turn, and I realized that this was not the moment for reaction. It was the moment for definition, not of what they believed, but of what was actually true. And as I prepared to speak, I felt no urgency, no pressure, just a steady certainty that the foundation I had built was about to become visible in a way they had not anticipated, and that once it did, nothing they had assumed would remain intact in the way they expected. The room held a stillness that felt different from silence, not empty, but waiting, as if every word that had just been spoken was suspended in the air, waiting to be tested against something more solid. And I sat there with my hands resting lightly on the table, looking at the papers Emily had so carefully arranged, at the structure she believed would guide everything forward, and then I looked up at her, meeting her gaze without challenge, without resistance, just with a calm steadiness that made her pause for a fraction of a second longer than she intended. "You have both put a great deal of thought into this," I said, my voice even, measured, and Robert nodded immediately, leaning forward slightly as if ready to reinforce her position. "We just want to make things simpler," he added, "clearer for everyone." And I inclined my head slightly, acknowledging his words, because on the surface, what he said sounded reasonable, logical even, and that was exactly why it worked so well for them, because they had built their plan on something that appeared clean, structured, easy to accept. I reached into my folder, the same one I had carried quietly for the past few days, and I placed it on the table in front of me, opening it with a slow, deliberate motion, not to create tension, but to allow the moment to settle fully into what it was about to become, and I could feel their attention shift, subtle but immediate, as they watched me, as they waited to see how I would respond. Still believing that this was simply a formality, a confirmation, something that would align with what they had already decided. Clarity is important, I continued, sliding a set of documents across the table toward them, which is why I took the time to review everything carefully. Emily reached for the papers first, her movements confident, practiced, and she began scanning the pages, her expression focused, controlled. But as her eyes moved down the first section, something in that control shifted, not dramatically, not outwardly. Just enough for me to see that the expectation she had been holding was beginning to encounter something it had not accounted for. Robert leaned in beside her, reading over her shoulder, his brow tightening slightly, and Daniel, seated quietly to the side, watched all of us with a level of attention that felt grounded, present, as if he understood that this was the moment where everything would become clear. "This does not match what we discussed," Emily said finally, her voice still composed, but no longer as certain, and I folded my hands together gently, resting them on the table. "It reflects what has always been in place," I replied, not correcting her, not contradicting her, simply stating what was true, and Robert straightened slightly, his expression shifting from casual confidence to something more focused, more alert. "Margaret," he said, "I thought we agreed that the property would be restructured," and I met his gaze, holding it steadily. "We agreed that clarity was needed," I said, "and this provides exactly that." There was a pause then, longer this time, the kind that does not invite immediate response, because it requires understanding first, and I could see it beginning to form, not fully, not completely, but enough for them to realize that what they had assumed was not aligned with what was actually documented. Emily turned another page, then another, her movements slower now, more deliberate, as if she were recalibrating, searching for something that would bring the documents back into alignment with her expectations. And when she looked up again, there was a subtle shift in her expression, not confusion, but recognition, the kind that comes when a plan encounters a boundary it cannot move through. "The trust," she said quietly, almost to herself, and I nodded once. A small, simple acknowledgement. "It has always governed the structure of everything connected to this property." I explained, my tone calm, clear, without emphasis, because the strength of what I was saying did not require it. Including decisions about transfer, ownership, and authority. Robert leaned back slightly, processing, his hands resting on the table. And for the first time since this conversation began, he did not immediately respond, because what he was seeing was not something he had anticipated needing to respond to. Daniel exhaled softly, not in surprise, but in understanding, and I glanced at him briefly, recognizing the moment. When observation becomes clarity, when something that has felt uncertain suddenly takes shape. "So none of this," Emily began, gesturing lightly toward her papers, "is actually applicable," and I considered her words for a moment before answering, not because I needed time, but because I chose precision. "It reflects an intention," I said, "but intention alone does not redefine structure." The room settled again, not into silence, but into a different kind of awareness, one where assumptions were no longer carrying the weight they had just moments before, and I could see it in the way they held themselves, in the way their focus shifted from presenting to understanding, from asserting to reassessing. I did not press the moment, did not expand beyond what was necessary, because the clarity was already there, fully visible, requiring no further explanation to be understood, and as I closed my folder gently, returning it to my side of the table, I realized that what had just taken place was not a confrontation, not a reversal, but a quiet correction, a realignment of what had always been true with what had been assumed to be possible. And in that space, without raising my voice, without disrupting the calm of the room, the entire direction of their plan had shifted, not because I had taken something from them, but because they had never truly possessed it to begin with. The silence that followed did not feel empty. It felt full, like a room that had finally heard the truth and was now adjusting to it. And I remained seated with the same calm posture, my hands still resting lightly on the table, as Emily slowly placed the documents back down in front of her, her movements more careful now, more measured, as if she were recalculating each step in real time, while Robert leaned back in his chair, his expression no longer relaxed, no longer certain, but not yet fully unsettled either, caught somewhere between what he had believed and what he was beginning to understand. "There must be a way to revise this," he said after a moment. his voice controlled, deliberate, as though approaching the situation as something that could still be managed, still be adjusted into alignment with his expectations, and I looked at him without interruption, allowing him to continue. Because what people say when they are trying to regain control often reveals more than what they say when they believe they already have it. If the trust governs the structure, he went on, then we can update the trust, make the necessary changes, bring everything in line with what we discussed. And Emily nodded slightly, her focus returning, her confidence attempting to reassemble itself around a new angle, a new approach, and I listened to them both, without reacting, without correcting immediately, because what mattered was not just what they said, but how long it took for them to reach the limits of what they thought was possible. When they paused, I inclined my head slightly, acknowledging the direction of their thinking. Adjustments to a trust are not based on discussion, I said calmly. They are based on authority, structure, and conditions that were defined long before this conversation. Emily's eyes shifted briefly, her attention sharpening again, and she leaned forward slightly. Then we need to understand those conditions, she replied, her tone steady but no longer as fluid as before, and I nodded once, because that was a reasonable statement, even if it came from a place that had only just begun to recognize its own limitations. I reached into my folder once more, not with urgency, but with the same deliberate pace I had maintained throughout, and I placed another set of documents on the table, turning them slightly so they faced both of them clearly. And this time, I did not need to explain immediately, because the structure of what was written spoke for itself in a way that required attention rather than interpretation. Robert leaned forward again, his focus more intent now, his earlier ease replaced with a careful concentration, and Emily followed, scanning the pages with a precision that reflected her effort to regain control of the situation, to find a path forward that still aligned with her expectations. But as they read, I could see the shift deepen, not sudden, not dramatic, but undeniable, as the framework they had assumed could be reshaped revealed itself to be far more defined than they had anticipated. This places decision authority solely. Emily began, her voice trailing slightly as she continued reading, and I completed the thought quietly. With the original trustee, I said, and Robert looked up at me then, really looked at me, not as someone to be guided or persuaded, but as someone he was. Now trying to reassess, to understand within a structure he had not fully considered before. You never mentioned this, he said, not accusing, not yet, but searching, and I met his gaze evenly. You never asked. I replied, and there was no sharpness in my tone, no defensiveness, just a simple statement of fact, because the truth, when stated without emotion, tends to settle more heavily than when it is delivered with force. Daniel shifted slightly in his seat, his attention moving between all of us, and I could see that he was beginning to see the full outline of what had been happening, not just the surface interactions, but the underlying structure that had been quietly holding everything in place, and he did not speak, because he did not need to. The understanding was already there. Emily turned another page, then closed the document slowly, placing it back on the table with a level of care that matched the new awareness settling into the room, and she exhaled softly, not in frustration, but in recognition. So none of this changes without your approval, she said, her voice steady again, but now grounded in something more accurate, and I nodded once. Not approval, I said. Alignment with the structure that already exists. And that distinction mattered, not because it shifted power, but because it clarified where that power had always been anchored. The room grew quiet again, but this time it was not the silence of anticipation, it was the silence of recalibration, of people adjusting their understanding to match a reality that had not moved, only been revealed, and I did not rush to fill it, did not expand beyond what was necessary, because everything that needed to be understood was already present, fully visible, requiring no further explanation. Robert leaned back once more, his hands resting on the arms of his chair, his posture no longer carrying the same certainty it had before, and Emily sat upright, her focus inward now, her thoughts moving through possibilities that no longer aligned with the outcome she had expected, and I remained where I was, my position unchanged, my presence steady, because this moment was not about asserting control, it was about allowing clarity to take its place naturally, without resistance, without force. After a few minutes, Robert spoke again, his tone quieter, more measured. "We will need to review this more carefully." And I inclined my head slightly. "Of course," I said, because review was exactly what this required. Not persuasion, not negotiation, just a clear understanding of what was already in place. The meeting ended not with a conclusion, but with a shift, subtle but complete. And as we all stood from the table, moving back into the familiar spaces of the house, I could feel the difference in the air, not tension, not conflict, but awareness. And awareness, once established, does not easily return to assumption. And as I walked toward the window, looking out at the quiet street beyond, I understood that nothing had been taken from them in this moment. Nothing had been reversed or undone, but everything they believed had already been settled was now open again, not for argument, but for reality. And that, more than anything, was what changed the direction of everything that would follow. The rest of the day unfolded in a way that looked almost identical to the ones before it, but felt entirely different, as if the house itself had adjusted its balance, no longer leaning toward assumption, but settling into something more grounded, more defined. And I moved through each room with that same quiet awareness, noticing how small things had shifted without anyone needing to acknowledge it directly. Emily spoke less that afternoon, not because she had nothing to say, but because she was thinking, recalibrating. Her confidence no longer automatic, now filtered through the new structure she had just encountered. And Robert, who had once carried conversations forward with ease, now paused more often, choosing his words with greater care, as though testing them against something unseen before letting them settle into the room. Daniel remained steady, his presence unchanged in tone but deeper in understanding. And I could see that he was no longer observing from uncertainty. He was observing with clarity, recognizing the quiet shift that had taken place without needing it to be explained. As evening approached, I found myself back in the kitchen, preparing a simple meal, nothing elaborate this time, just something warm, something familiar, and I moved through the motions with a calm precision that came not from routine, but from intention, because now every action felt like a choice rather than an obligation. And that distinction made even the smallest task feel different. Robert entered the room while I was setting the table, his steps slower, his posture less certain than it had been before, and he stood there for a moment as if deciding how to begin. "Margaret," he said finally, his voice quieter than usual, "about earlier." And I looked up, meeting his gaze without tension, without resistance, simply present, and he continued, "I think we may have approached things too quickly." And I inclined my head slightly, acknowledging his words, not as an admission, not as an apology, but as a recognition, and I placed the last plate on the table before responding. "Clarity often changes the pace of things," I said, my tone even, and he nodded slowly, absorbing that, as if realizing that what had once felt settled was now something that required careful consideration. Emily joined us a moment later, her expression composed but more reserved, and she took a seat without immediately speaking, her attention moving between the two of us. And for a brief moment, there was no conversation, just the quiet presence of three people adjusting to a new understanding that had not yet been fully defined. Dinner passed without tension, without conflict, but also without the easy certainty that had filled the room just days before. And instead, there was a subtle awareness in every exchange, a carefulness in tone, a recognition that what had been assumed could no longer be treated as fact. And I allowed that awareness to remain undisturbed, because it was doing exactly what it needed to do, reshaping the space without force. After the meal, as we moved into the living room, Robert paused near the doorway, turning back toward me. "We should revisit everything," he said. "Take the time to understand how this is structured." And I nodded once, because that was no longer a suggestion, it was a necessity, and he seemed to understand that as well. Later that night, as the house grew quiet again, I sat by the window, looking out at the stillness beyond the glass, and I thought about how easily people build expectations on incomplete information, how naturally they move forward when something appears simple, and how quickly that simplicity dissolves when the full picture comes into view. And I realized that what had changed was not the structure itself, not the foundation that had been in place long before any of this began, but the awareness of it. the visibility of it. And once something becomes visible, it cannot return to being overlooked. The following morning brought a different kind of energy, not tense, not uncertain, but focused, and Robert approached me early, a set of papers in his hand, his expression serious but composed. "I have been reviewing what you showed us," he said, "and I think we need to sit down again, properly, with all of it laid out." And I met his gaze, seeing in it not the confidence he had carried before, but a willingness to understand, and I nodded. "That would be appropriate," I replied, because now the conversation was no longer about aligning with assumptions, it was about aligning with reality. Emily joined us shortly after, her demeanor controlled but quieter, and as we gathered once more at the table, the same table that had held so many different meanings over the past few days, I noticed how the positions had shifted without being reassigned, how no one moved to claim the head of the table, how no one directed the conversation before it began, and I took my seat calmly, not at the center, not at the edge, but exactly where I chose to sit, and that choice, simple as it was, carried more weight than any words that could have been spoken. This time, the conversation unfolded differently, not presented as a plan, not structured as a proposal, but approached as a review, a careful examination of what already existed. And as we moved through each document, each detail, each condition, I spoke only when necessary, clarifying where clarity was needed, leaving space where understanding had to form on its own, and I watched as both Robert and Emily adjusted their perspectives, not all at once, not completely, but enough to recognize that what they had believed to be flexible was in fact firmly defined, and that the outcome they had assumed was no longer something they could simply move toward without consideration. The discussion did not end with a conclusion. It ended with a shift in direction, subtle but undeniable, and as we stood from the table once more, I understood that this was not the moment of resolution. It was the moment where the path forward had changed, where control had not been taken or reclaimed, but revealed, and in that revelation, everything they had expected was now something they would have to reconsider, not because I had opposed them, but because the structure they had overlooked had quietly, steadily, remained exactly where it had always been. The next few days did not bring any dramatic changes on the surface, but beneath that calm, something fundamental had already shifted, and I could feel it in the way the house held its silence, not as something empty, but as something settled, as if every room had quietly acknowledged what had taken place and adjusted accordingly. Robert moved through the space with a different kind of awareness now, no longer assuming ease, no longer speaking with the same unchallenged certainty, and I noticed how he paused more often before beginning a sentence, how he measured his tone, as though he understood that what he said would now be heard differently, not filtered through trust, but through clarity. Emily, in contrast, became more contained, her presence still composed, still deliberate, but no longer expanding into the space as it had before, and while she continued to engage in conversations about the future, her language shifted, less declarative, more conditional, as if she were testing each idea before allowing it to fully take shape. And I observed all of this without interruption, without commentary, because change, when it is real, does not need to be pointed out. It reveals itself through pattern. Daniel remained steady, but there was a quiet confidence in him now that had not been there before, not because he had gained control over anything, but because he had gained understanding, and understanding, once established, creates its own kind of stability. And one afternoon, as we sat together in the den, he looked at me with a calm certainty that mirrored my own. "You knew all along," he said, not as a question, but as a realization, and I met his gaze, allowing a small, genuine smile to form. "I knew enough," I replied, "because knowing everything is not what matters. Knowing what to do with what you know is what changes the outcome." Later that evening, Robert approached me again, this time without hesitation, his expression direct, his tone more grounded than it had been in days. "I have been thinking," he said, taking a seat across from me, "about everything, the structure, the trust, all of it." And I listened, giving him the space to speak without interruption, because what he said now would not come from assumption. It would come from adjustment, from the process of aligning what he had believed with what he now understood. "I realized that I made decisions based on an incomplete picture," he continued, and I should have approached this differently. And I inclined my head slightly, acknowledging his words, not as an apology, not as a resolution, but as a step, and he continued, I would like to move forward in a way that respects the structure that is already in place. And I considered that carefully, not because I doubted his sincerity, but because I understood that intention, while important, does not redefine foundation, and I responded with the same calm precision that had guided me through every step of this process. Moving forward requires understanding, not just agreement, I said, and he nodded, absorbing that. Because this was no longer a conversation about what felt right, it was a conversation about what was defined, what was established, what could not be reshaped without consideration of everything that had already been built. Emily joined us shortly after, her posture composed, her tone measured, and she took a seat without attempting to direct the conversation, which in itself marked a shift, and she spoke carefully, choosing her words with intention. I think we all need to reassess our expectations, she said, and I looked at her, seeing not the certainty she had carried before, but a more deliberate awareness, and I nodded once. Expectations often change when understanding becomes clearer, I replied, and there was a brief pause, not uncomfortable, not tense, but reflective, as if each of us was recognizing that the structure we were now working within was not new. It had simply been overlooked. The conversation that followed was not dramatic, not confrontational, but it was precise, focused on details, on definitions, on what was actually possible within the framework that had always existed. And as we spoke, I noticed how the dynamic had shifted completely, not because anyone had taken control, but because the control that had always been present was now acknowledged, respected in a way it had not been before. The following morning, I walked through the house with a different kind of ease, not because anything had been resolved in a traditional sense, but because the uncertainty that had once filled the space was gone, replaced by a clear understanding of where everything stood. And as I paused by the dining table, the same one that had held so many different meanings over the past days, I ran my hand lightly along its surface once more, not as a gesture of nostalgia, but as a recognition, a quiet acknowledgement that this space, like everything else, had not been taken, had not been reassigned. It had simply been misunderstood, and now that misunderstanding had been corrected, later that day, as sunlight filtered through the windows and filled the rooms with a soft, steady warmth, I realized that what had changed was not just the structure of the situation, but my relationship to it. I was no longer responding, no longer adjusting myself to fit within expectations that had been placed around me. I was simply standing within what had always been mine to define, and that shift, though quiet, though invisible to anyone who was not looking closely, was complete. And as I moved through the house, through the life I had built, I understood with a calm certainty that nothing had been lost, nothing had been taken, and everything that mattered had remained exactly where it belonged. The days that followed did not need to announce themselves as different, because the difference was already settled into every quiet corner of the house, into the way conversations began and ended, into the pauses between words that had once been filled with assumption and were now filled with awareness. And I moved through those days with a calm that no longer came from maintaining balance for everyone else, but from understanding exactly where that balance had always been anchored. Robert, adjusted in ways that were subtle but consistent, not dramatic enough to be called change by anyone who was not paying attention, but clear enough for me to recognize that he had shifted from leading with certainty to moving with consideration. And there was something almost reflective in the way he approached conversations now, as if he were measuring not just what he wanted to say, but whether it aligned with what he had come to understand. And I did not guide that process, did not correct it, because it was not something that needed direction. It simply needed space to settle. Emily, too, found a new rhythm, one that was quieter, more deliberate, her confidence no longer extending outward in the same effortless way, but instead held closer, shaped by a recognition that what she had once believed to be flexible was in fact firmly defined. And while she continued to engage, to offer ideas, to participate in the life of the house, there was a noticeable shift in how she did so, not asserting, not assuming, but considering, and that shift, though small in appearance, carried a depth that could not be reversed easily. Daniel remained steady, But there was a lightness in him now that had not been there before, not because anything had been given to him, but because something had been clarified, and clarity, once established, removes a kind of quiet tension that people often do not realize they are carrying. And one afternoon, as we sat together by the window, watching the late winter light stretch across the yard, he spoke without hesitation. "It feels different now," and I nodded, because it did, not in a way that needed to be explained, but in a way that could be felt in the simplest moments, in the absence of something that had once been present. The house itself seemed to reflect that change, not in its structure, not in its appearance, but in its atmosphere, the way sound moved through it, the way silence settled into it. And I found myself noticing details I had overlooked before, not because they had been hidden, but because I had been focused on holding everything together rather than seeing it clearly. And now, without that weight, everything felt more defined, more real. One evening, as I stood once again in the dining room, the same space where everything had quietly revealed itself, I looked at the table, at the chairs, at the place where my name had once been removed without explanation, and I realized that what had happened there had not taken anything from me. It had simply shown me what others believed they could take, and in doing so, it had given me something far more valuable, a clear understanding of where I stood, not within their expectations, but within the structure that had always been mine to define. I did not move the chairs, did not rearrange the table, did not restore anything to what it had been before, because there was no need to return to a version of something that had been built on misunderstanding. Instead, I allowed it to remain exactly as it was, a quiet reminder that clarity does not require correction, it requires recognition. Later that night, as I prepared to turn off the lights, Robert paused beside me in the hallway, his presence calm, his expression thoughtful, and he said, "I understand things differently now." And I looked at him, seeing not the man who had once assumed control, but the one who had come to recognize its boundaries, and I nodded once. "Understanding changes everything," I replied, and there was nothing more to add, because what needed to be acknowledged had already been acknowledged. Emily passed by a moment later, her steps measured, her gaze steady, and she offered a small, respectful nod, not as a gesture of defeat, but as a recognition, and I returned it with the same quiet composure. Because this was not about winning or losing, it was about seeing clearly, and once that happens, everything else adjusts naturally. As the house settled into silence once more, I stood for a moment longer, looking down the hallway, feeling the stillness settle around me. And I understood that the story I had been living had not ended. It had simply been rewritten, not by force, not by conflict, but by clarity, by the quiet, deliberate decision to stand within what had always been true rather than adjust to what others expected it to be. I turned off the last light and made my way upstairs, my steps steady, my mind calm. And as I closed the door behind me, I realized that I had not fought for a place at that table. I had not argued for recognition. I had not needed to, because the truth does not require permission to exist. It simply waits until it is seen. And once it is, everything else falls into its proper place, not with noise, not with resistance, but with a quiet finality that leaves no question about what was always there, waiting to be understood.